A number of years ago, I was asked by my family to go visit an old family gravestone in Darlington, South Carolina. I had found it on a map. I was making my way down these dirt roads trying to find the right direction, and I knew I was in the right place because I was to look for the Black Creek Baptist Church. And there I found the old ruins of the church, and there I was rounding a corner trying to find an ancient cemetery. And there on the side of the dirt road was a very intriguing little sign just off the side of the dirt that read, "This road leads to a cemetery." Well, forever the preacher, I ripped out this checkbook slip and wrote on the front of it, "All roads end in a cemetery." All roads end in a cemetery. Gettysburg, Pearl Harbor, Iwo Jima, Pork Chop Hill, Selma, the Lorraine Motel, My Lai, the Stonewall Inn, Wounded Knee, the World Trade Center, Baghdad, Newtown, Parkland, COVID-19. All roads end in a cemetery, except one, the Easter Road. The Easter Road leads to Calvary, and then beyond death to the empty tomb. And then the road continues to Emmaus. The Easter Road is the road of life. Oh, to be sure, Jesus' death on Good Friday was cosmic and world-shaking. But for Mary the mother and Mary Magdalene and the other women and the 11 disciples, and for Cleopas and his companion, it was immensely personal. It wasn't just a cosmic affair. It was very personal. Their friend, their companion, their guide, their teacher was brutally murdered on a Roman cross at the city dump, no less, and then placed in a tomb. No one else in the universe could have done that for him. In fact, no one else in the universe can do it for you or for me. Death is cosmic, it's universal, but it's intensely personal. This past year, I reread an account, maybe known to you, about the personal reality of death. It's called "I Heard the Owl Call My Name." It's about an Anglican priest who was sent by his bishop to a Native American village in present-day British Columbia. He was there to establish a church and a school and a hospital, etc. And during the first number of months, everything seemed to be going well. But what was happening, unknown to the priest, was that he was sick. In fact, he was dying, but he didn't know it. He learned during those early months that the villagers had a belief in their own culture that when you hear the owl call your name, then you know your death is imminent. One night, knowing this about the culture and about the reality of death, that young priest heard the owl call his name. It was frightening at one level, but it was also strangely comforting for him to know that the owl of death was calling upon him and that he could now ready himself for this new stage of his living. Good Friday is when you and I hear the owl call Jesus' name. And while that's true, during this season of Easter, there's another reality that's just as personal. Yes, resurrection is world-shaking and is cosmic and universal in its nature. But this story of resurrection is also immensely personal. It was personal for Mary Magdalene. It was personal for Jesus' mother. It was very personal for the women who also experienced something of the new life of Jesus. It was personal for the other 11 disciples as they gathered in the upper room and as they met him on the beach. And it was very personal also in today's text for Cleopas and his companion. You just heard the story. On Easter afternoon, that same afternoon, Cleopas and his companion, we don't know whether it was his wife or his brother or his son. It could be that Luke meant it to be any of us, and that they were going to Emmaus, which doesn't appear on any ancient maps. Emmaus could be any village, any road, any town, any neighborhood where you and I might live. In other words, Luke might mean that you and I then are Cleopas's companion. And on that road to Emmaus, which could be your neighborhood and mine, they begin to recount all of the things that have happened during the last week. They're forlorn, they're sad, they're downstruck. Their friend, who they had hoped to be the Redeemer, died a brutal death on Friday. They're at least disappointed, if not something more. Then, to their great surprise, someone comes and begins to walk with them. He's wondering with them what they've been talking about, of course, and they've been talking about Jesus of Nazareth. He asks them to tell them their account. They tell him. He pauses then and says, "Oh, my friends, how slow of heart you are to how this fits into all of salvation history, all of the ways that God has been loving God's creation from the beginning, when you and I were the apple of God's eye in the people of Adam and Eve, and how God has been loving us into communion with God all these generations. All the way up until now," Jesus seems to be saying, and we would say as Cleopas' companion, all the way up to the present. He then stays with them, we're told. They plead with him, "Come and stay. It's late. The hour is dark. Come and have supper with us." And of course, we learn the powerful text then of Luke 24, when Jesus then takes the bread as the host, no longer as the guest, raises that bread, breaks that bread, shares it. We think then not only with them, but lavishly in the first church beyond measure, and continues to share God's bounty of the broken bread of the holy meal with God's people throughout the ages. Cleopas and his companion then note later, "We were astounded. Our hearts burned within us, did they not, when he walked with us on the road, when he opened the pages of scriptures to us, when he was known to us in the breaking of the bread." Resurrection was no longer just a universal and cosmic event. It was immensely personal. Came to them, met them in their own condition, then gave them a great awareness of resurrection, of their own living, and how they could participate in this great event of new life, of new endeavor. You and I have that outstanding possibility. Yes, the resurrection was back there 2,000 years ago, but it's immensely personal for us. It can meet us where we are there where you are right now by your screen, where we are here in the cathedral. And notice then what happens to Cleopas and his companion, that's you, that's me, is that they are then sent back to Jerusalem and then beyond Jerusalem to the uttermost parts of the world. They go back to Jerusalem to proclaim the resurrection, to practice resurrection. Let me ask you this morning, this third Sunday of Easter, have you seen the risen Christ? Have you experienced something of the new life that happens from the empty tomb? Have you seen the risen Christ take hold of some occasion, some person, some group, and transform him, her, or them? Yes. All of us could say with me this morning, I've seen the risen Christ, in my case, take hold of a drifting young man and change him from a self-centered, sort of self-reliant person into a fairly decent person who tries to do his best. I've seen the risen Christ heal deep hurts, those who are caught in child abuse or spousal abuse. I've seen the risen Christ staring back at me through the eyes and the heart of a starving child in Haiti, through the bloated stomach and the matchstick legs, as if to say, we need each other. I have seen the risen Christ comfort a shattered mother when she learns that her son was born Down syndrome. I've seen the risen Christ take hold of young people who were adrift, who had no idea what they were going to do with their lives. I've seen the risen Christ meet people in the hospital room who were dying and wanted to receive hope. I've seen the risen Christ encounter a woman 7 years ago who I met at a parish occasion because it was a newcomer gathering. She was new to our congregation. I noticed her in the corner, however. She was older then, in her mid to late 70s. I noticed her because she was hunched over, seemed to be in pain, with a walker. No one was with her. I went over to her, offered her a glass of punch. She and I began to have a conversation. She told me that she had endured a lot of illness lately, but then when she was young, she was a high-priced national model. She had moved to Texas from Los Angeles, having spent 30 years in Southern California, making big salaries and a big reputation. She invited me to come over to her place and to have communion. I went with a couple of our people to meet with her and get to know her a little bit. I noticed in her front foyer area there were photos then of her when she was a model, tall, beautiful, statuesque, gorgeous. I mean, stunning pictures of this young woman. I could see why she was a famous model. She told us that day as we had communion that, quite frankly, she had never really felt the presence of God in her life. She had been somewhat of a churchgoer, had gone sporadically in Southern California, wanted to be more invested in our own congregation in Dallas. However, she did admit, there's nothing really personal about God that I've ever experienced. Later that year, her first year with us, her condition worsened. She had cancer. It had moved around her body. Part of those young women who had gone with me to have communion then put together a group of 8 women. They decided that they would contact her. They would become her family in our congregation. As her condition worsened and she was more bedridden, that group of young women went over there. They were busy professional people, but they took 2 hours each per week. They divided themselves up. Each took a day, and then there was a sub, and they began to cook meals and clean her apartment. They began to do her grocery shopping. they began to pray for her and befriend her. They began to take an interest in her condition, you see. 2 hours each per week for weeks and weeks and weeks. These wonderful professional women then put on the towel of the servant and began to administer to them. After a number of months, of course, she was then hardly able to move. They called me to have last rites. That same group then gathered around her bed. She then said to all of us in halting terms, you know, last year when we first met and you were with us with communion, she said, I said then that I had never had a first count personal experience of God's presence in my life. You know, she said, that's changed. That's changed. I've experienced God's living presence through these wonderful women who have come to be with me. God has come to me in a very special way. And I want you to know that I have now seen the resurrection in action. And now, as I'm getting ready to die, she said to all of us, I have a great peace that's come over me. Yes, I love those days when I was accounted famous and those days when they paid me a great salary. But it's these days that I cherish the most. I'm now ready to die because I know I'm ready for resurrection. All roads lead to a cemetery, except one, the Easter road. The Easter road goes into Calvary, where Jesus died for us in love. The Easter road continues then to travel through the empty tomb. The Easter road then travels to Emmaus and travels to this church. The Easter road travels down your road and your lane and meets you. Good Friday is when we hear the owl call our name. Easter is when we hear the risen Christ call our name. Amen.
Amen.